Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. We use them all the time, but have you ever stopped to think about fire extinguishers? The history behind them.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yes.
Full of crazy inventions and surprising discoveries.
Yeah, and maybe even a few explosions along the way.
Exactly, like a battle against one of nature's most powerful forces. And speaking of battling fire, did you know some of the earliest fire extinguishers were literally gunpowder powered?
Yeah, back in 1723, the very first patented fire extinguisher was essentially a cask filled with a fire extinguishing solution and a separate chamber of gunpowder. The idea was to ignite the gunpowder, which would then scatter the solution over the flames.
Wow, talk about fighting fire with fire. That sounds incredibly dangerous, though.
Oh, it certainly wasn't without its risks. I can only imagine the chaos and potential for unintended consequences with such a volatile method.
And those early extinguishers weren't exactly user-friendly either. Imagine fumbling with a gunpowder power device in the heat of the moment. But as technology advanced, so did our methods of firefighting. I'm thinking of those glass fire extinguisher grenades we often see in historical depictions. What can you tell us about those?
Those glass grenades were surprisingly common in the late 19th century. They were essentially glass spheres filled with various solutions, like salt water or carbon tetrachloride, designed to be thrown at the base of a fire.
Can you imagine hurling a fragile glass sphere at a raging fire? It seems almost counterintuitive, but I guess that's what they had to work with back then.
It highlights the desperation people felt when faced with a fire. And those glass grenades actually represent an important step forward. They were portable, relatively inexpensive, and at least attempted to contain the fire extinguishing agent.
It's amazing to think how far we've come from those early days. The soda acid extinguisher, for instance, became a mainstay for much of the 20th century. It was a major leap forward in terms of both effectiveness and ease of use.
The soda acid extinguisher was a clever invention that relied on a chemical reaction to generate pressure. It contained a solution of water and sodium bicarbonate, along with a separate vial of sulfuric acid. When activated, the vial would break, mixing the acid with the bicarbonate solution. This reaction produced carbon dioxide gas, which pressurized the extinguisher and forced the water out through a hose or nozzle.
It's like a mini chemistry experiment happening right inside the extinguisher. But like those glass grenades, the soda acid extinguisher had its limitations. And eventually, a new contender entered the scene. The carbon tetrachloride extinguisher.
The carbon tetrachloride extinguisher was particularly effective because it worked by interrupting the chemical chain reaction that fuels a fire. The liquid vaporized, essentially choking the flames and preventing them from spreading.
So it was a game changer in terms of effectiveness. Why did it eventually fall out of favor?
Well, as effective as it was, it had a major downside: toxicity. Exposure to 4 concentrations of carbon tetrachloride could cause serious health problems, damaging the nervous system and internal organs. And if that wasn't bad enough, the heat from a fire could actually convert carbon tetrachloride into phosgene gas, a deadly chemical weapon.
That's a pretty terrifying thought, using an extinguisher that could potentially create a chemical weapon. I'm glad they found safer alternatives. Speaking of safer alternatives, how did the carbon dioxide extinguisher, which we still use today, come about?
The CO2 extinguisher has a fascinating origin story. The Walter Kidd Company invented it in 1924 in response to a request from Bell Telephone. They needed a non-conductive chemical to extinguish fires in their telephone switchboards, which were notoriously difficult to protect.
So the need to protect early telephone systems led to one of the most widely used fire extinguishers today. That's a fantastic example of how necessity drives innovation. But before we delve further into the world of modern extinguishers, let's talk about the CO2 extinguisher and how it came to be. It's actually a pretty ingenious solution,
Oh, it is?
using carbon dioxide to displace oxygen and effectively smother the flames.
Yeah.
I know we see these CO2 extinguishers all over the place, kitchens, garages, labs. But are they effective against all types of fires?
That's where understanding fire extinguisher classifications comes in. It's like having the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw, would you?
Definitely not. So how do we know which extinguisher is the right tool for which type of fire?
Well, different parts of the world have slightly different classification systems, but the basic principle is the same: matching the extinguisher to the fuel source of the fire. For instance, in Australia and New Zealand, they use color-coded bands near the top of the extinguisher. A blue band, for example, indicates a foam extinguisher, which is typically used for Class A and B fires, involving ordinary combustibles like wood and paper, and flammable liquids like gasoline.
So just a quick glance at the color tells you what type of extinguisher it is. What about in the UK? They have their own system, right?
That's right. In the UK, fire extinguishers are still predominantly red, but they use a panel or band of a second color to indicate the contents. A cream panel signifies a foam extinguisher, while a blue panel indicates a dry powder extinguisher, which can be used on a wide range of fires, including those involving electrical equipment.
It seems like these color coding systems make it much easier to identify the right extinguisher in an emergency. But what about those letter classifications we see, the A, B, C, and D? What do those represent?
Those letters refer to the classes of fires based on the type of fuel involved. Class A fires, as we mentioned, involve ordinary combustibles like wood, paper, and cloth. Class B fire involve flammable liquids like gasoline oil and grease. Class C fires involve energized electrical equipment. And Class D fires involve combustible metals.
Combustible metals. I never really thought about metals catching fire.
You might be surprised to learn that some metals like magnesium and titanium are highly flammable. That's why Class D fire extinguishers are specifically designed for extinguishing metal fires, often using a dry powder agent.
So if I'm working in a machine shop or a lab where I might encounter burning metals, I would definitely need a specialized Class D extinguisher. It really highlights how crucial it is to understand these classifications and have the right extinguisher for the job.
Absolutely. Using the wrong type of extinguisher can not only be ineffective, but it can actually make the situation worse. For instance, spraying water on a grease fire can cause the flames to spread rapidly, making the fire even more dangerous.
That's a good reminder to pay attention to those classifications. Now, you mentioned earlier that there's a whole world of specialized extinguishing agents. Beyond the common dry chemical and foam extinguishers, what are some of those more unique agents?
Well, we have clean agents like halon and its replacements, which are often used in environments where traditional extinguishing agents could cause damage, like computer server rooms, museums, or even aircraft.
Clean agents. Why are they called clean?
They get their name from the fact that they don't leave behind any residue after they've been used. This is incredibly important in situations where residue could damage sensitive equipment or valuable artifacts.
So it's not just about putting out the fire, but also about minimizing any collateral damage. That makes a lot of sense, especially in those sensitive environments.
Exactly. And then you have more specialized agents like the ones used for those combustible metal fires we talked about, dry powder agents that are designed to smother and cool the burning metal.
It seems like there's a specific type of extinguisher for almost every imaginable fire hazard. Now I'm curious, are there any guidelines or regulations for where and how these fire extinguishers should be installed in buildings?
That's where organizations like the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, come in. They set guidelines to ensure that fire extinguishers are accessible in emergencies. And that includes considering people with disabilities. For example, the NFPA recommends specific mounting heights based on the weight of the extinguisher, making sure they are reachable for everyone.
So it's not just about slapping an extinguisher on the wall. There's a lot of thought that goes into making sure they're properly placed and accessible.
Absolutely. The ADA also has guidelines for things like the maximum protrusion of an extinguisher from the wall. To prevent hazards for people with low vision, it's really about making sure everyone has a fair chance to access and use these life-saving devices in an emergency.
It's fascinating to think about all the different factors that go into something as seemingly simple as fire extinguisher placement. Now, before we wrap up our discussion on extinguishers, I have one more question. Why is regular maintenance so crucial?
That's a great question. Regular maintenance is absolutely essential for ensuring that fire extinguishers are safe and effective when they're needed most. Neglecting maintenance can lead to some serious consequences, ranging from the extinguisher failing to discharge properly to something as drastic as the extinguisher itself exploding under pressure.
Exploding? That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It can be. There have been cases where corroded extinguishers have exploded, causing injuries and even fatalities. That's why regular inspections and proper maintenance are so critical.
So what does fire extinguisher maintenance actually entail? Do I need to call a specialist every time?
It depends on the level of maintenance required. There are basic visual inspections that you can do yourself, like checking the pressure gauge and looking for any signs of damage or corrosion. These basic checks should ideally be done at least once a month.
That sounds pretty straightforward, but what about the more in-depth maintenance?
For more extensive servicing, you'll need to call a qualified technician. They'll perform a thorough inspection of the extinguisher, checking the internal components, cleaning and lubricating moving parts, and recharging or replacing the extinguishing agent if necessary. The NFPA recommends an annual inspection and service by a qualified technician to ensure everything is in top working order.
So there's a lot more to fire extinguisher maintenance than just making sure they're full. It's about ensuring they're safe, reliable, and ready to perform when we need them most.
Exactly. Regular maintenance is an investment in safety and could potentially save lives.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive into the world of fire extinguishers.
It's amazing how much history, science, and engineering goes into something we often take for granted.
I completely agree. I've learned so much about the different types of extinguishers, the importance of classifications, and why regular maintenance is absolutely crucial. But before we sign off, what is one final thought you would like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, it really is remarkable how much we rely on these devices, yet rarely give them a second thought until we actually need them.
It's a testament to how defective they are at what they do. When you think about it, fire extinguishers are essentially our first line of defense against one of humanity's oldest adversaries, fire.
Hmm.
And that defense has certainly evolved over time. We've come a long way from those early gunpowder-powered contraptions and glass grenades. It makes me wonder what the future holds for fire suppression. Will we see even more specialized agents? Or perhaps entirely new technologies that we haven't even imagined yet?
That's what makes the field so fascinating. It's constantly evolving. We're already seeing research into using things like sound waves to extinguish fires, which could potentially revolutionize fire suppression, especially in environments like spacecraft or sensitive electronic systems.
Sound waves putting out fire. That sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
I know.
It really highlights how human ingenuity is constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
It does, doesn't it? And it's not just about new technologies either. There's a growing emphasis on sustainability and minimizing the environmental impact of fire suppression. The phasing out of halon, for instance, due to its ozone-depleting properties, shows how environmental concerns are increasingly shaping the field.
That's a really important point. We're not just fighting fire, we're also trying to do it in a way that protects our planet. It's like we're constantly refining our approach, finding that perfect balance between effectiveness and responsibility.
Exactly. And that's a journey that will continue to unfold as we learn more about fire, its behavior, and the best ways to combat it while minimizing any unintended consequences.
Well, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I started this thinking fire extinguishers were pretty straightforward, but there's so much more to them than meets the eye.
I'm glad you found it insightful. It's a testament to the fact that there's always something new to learn, even about things we think we know well.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll have to wrap things up for today, but thank you so much for joining us on this fiery journey into the world of fire extinguishers.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, remember to hit that subscribe button to catch more fascinating stories and deep dives right here on Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.